Thank you. Thank you for this junction and meeting in time
Thank you.
in a good way.
So I've been thinking about what it means to regenerate the earth we're on now for almost 30 years, which is a pretty good long time. Because my background, believe it or not, was electrical engineering. And I came out with an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering and pretty soon realized that all these brilliant people I was working with were busy destroying the planet we were living on. And it was a very interesting question. Why all these brilliant people were trapped in a way of thinking that resulted in them building things that destroyed the living earth that we were dependent on. And so I kind of went on a long journey and trying to figure that out. And in the interim, I've gotten to travel to many places and work with medicine people of many different indigenous groups. And one of the things that you realize is that the patterns are almost always the same. So that's what I want to talk about tonight, because I want to talk about what Tyson Yom Kapoor calls the indigenous way of thinking, right? And he basically points out that certain people have fetishized indigenous products of thought, but and tried to culturally appropriate them and so forth, but they miss the way of thinking behind that, the way of thinking that produced that. So one of the things that we see over and over again is this pattern. And when we started to try to identify this pattern, we called it greeting customs. And there are also patterns of when people come together to talk about what's going to happen in the future. There's patterns of bringing to mind all of the things that we need to be mindful of in order to have that conversation. One of the very famous ones, I got to learn the Thanksgiving address of the Haudenosaunee people from Jake Swamp, who was a sub-chief of the Mohawk or the Akwesasne people. And he shared that with the world is the way when they come together, if they're going to have an important conversation, the first thing they do is they give thanks and they bring into the room and are mindful for all the things that we're dependent upon. And what Yona just did through story was the same thing. Brought all the things that we are dependent upon into the room to remind us that we are dependent on the winds and the waters and the mountains. And so what I wanted to point out before anything else is that although you're going to see that the idea behind it, bringing these things into the room, you see it over and over again. But what's important is that each and every culture has their way of doing that comes from their people and their place and their tradition, right? So what I would say is the idea that when we all meet together like this, we need to bring a presencing of all that into the room with us. That is human. That is what it means to be a human being, right? And so the first little story I wanted to share was one that was given to me early on, which was when the Quaker people started interacting with the Haudenosaunee, there was an agreement. And the agreement, the way they told the story about the agreement was they said, we're going down, the Quaker people and the Haudenosaunee people, the Mohawk were talking to the Quaker people because in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk are the keepers of the Eastern Door. So if you want to talk to the Confederacy, you start by talking to the Akwesasne or the Mohawk people. And they said, here's what we're going to do. He said, we're going down the river of life in our canoe, and you are going down the river of life in your longboat. What we're going to do is, because we're all human beings, we're going to pull the two together occasionally, and we're going to talk across the transoms, and we're going to share wisdom from our cultures and so forth. But here's our treaty. We don't climb into your canoe, and you don't climb into our longboat. And what they were meaning by that is that the stories, the symbols, the language, the ceremonies of the Cherokee people are their way of being human that are specific to their people and their place. I have Irish Celtic ancestry that long ago had similar stories and symbols and language and ceremony and so on and so forth. So what we do is we should come together, and this is where I wanted to start off a conversation, because people oftentimes say, well, what about cultural appropriation? And I've thought about this for a lot. And it's like, what I've come to the conclusion and is this: we have a common heritage as human beings of a connection to place, a connection to each other, a connection to land. And some of the patterns of that show up again and again and again. What to me becomes cultural appropriation is when you go to somebody else's culture and you pick up their specific way of doing that, their stories, their symbols, their ceremonies, their songs. Now we have a problem, right? But what we can do is we can come together, and because different people from different places and different times living on different land, they have different relationship with place because place is different. And their history on the land is different. And so we can share wisdom with each other, but what we need to be doing is thinking about what are those patterns of connection behind that are common to all human beings. And then if we are trying to refine our connection to place, we need to discover the ceremonies and the songs and the stories and the symbols that are appropriate to who, if a people group has lost that, they need to discover that by working with the land, because the land will give that back to you. If you work with the land will provide you with that.